In just 90 days, I turned a cheating husband from a VP making six figures into a broken man living in his car. And it all started with a yellow sticky note she forgot to hide. Way back in the early 2000s, I began to suspect that my wife was up to something. Our two kids were about 4 and 6 years old, still young, but not so young they couldn't tell you something about what had happened in their day. They started talking a lot about staying with my wife's parents during the day, which wasn't really that strange in and of itself. But since my in-laws lived about 90 minutes away, doing so 2 or 3 times a week seemed a bit much. That was basically every day she wasn't working at her part-time job. When I asked her about it, she denied it, but she was never a good liar. Her face would get red, she'd avoid eye contact, and she'd start fidgeting with her wedding ring, a nervous habit I'd noticed over our 8 years of marriage. So, I started tracking the mileage on her car, and sure enough, she was driving an extra 400 or so miles per week. I knew some serious stuff was going on. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had come home early from my job at the engineering firm where I worked as a project manager. I sat down at the computer to check my emails, and there it was, a bright yellow sticky note with her AOL password written on it in her messy handwriting, stuck right next to the keyboard. She must have been in a hurry and forgot to put it away. I stared at that note for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes. My conscience was telling me not to violate her privacy, but my gut was screaming that something was seriously wrong. Finally, I couldn't resist. I logged into her AOL account and started reading her emails. What I found made my blood run cold. There were several email exchanges between her and her college best friend, Sarah, where they discussed in explicit detail how my wife was regularly having sex with one of her ex-boyfriends from high school. The emails were graphic and disgusting. Not only was she cheating on me, but she was also talking trash about this guy's wife, making fun of how she'd gotten fat after having kids. The cruelty of it hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. This was the woman I'd married, the mother of my children, the person I trusted completely. The emails went back months, maybe even longer. She'd been living a double life, and I'd been completely oblivious. I quickly printed out all the email exchanges and stashed them in a folder in my home office. I knew I needed more information before I made any moves. This wasn't just about catching her. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. That night at dinner, I watched her interact with our kids, helping them with their homework, asking about their day, acting like the perfect mother and wife. It was surreal. How could someone compartmentalize their life like this? How could she look me in the eye and ask about my day when she'd been with another man that afternoon? The next day, I called my friend Mike, who was a police officer in our town. I told him I needed advice about a personal situation without going into details. He listened patiently and then said, "You need to talk to Ron Martinez. He used to be on the force with me, but he left a few years ago to become a private investigator. He's the best at this kind of thing, and he's discreet." Mike gave me Ron's number, and I called him that same afternoon. Ron had a deep, gravelly voice that immediately made me feel like I was talking to someone who'd seen it all. When I explained my situation, he didn't seem surprised or judgmental. He just said, "This happens more than you'd think. Let's meet tomorrow and discuss what you need." I met Ron at a small coffee shop downtown the next evening. He was exactly what you'd expect from a former cop turned private investigator. About 50 years old, gray hair, sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. I handed him copies of the emails and told him everything I suspected. Ron studied the emails carefully, then looked up at me. "This is good evidence, but it's just the beginning. If you're thinking about divorce, you're going to need more than emails. You need documentation, photos, times, dates, locations. You need a complete picture of what's happening." I paid his retainer fee, $1,500, which was a lot of money for us at the time, but I knew it was necessary. Ron assured me he'd have answers within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I had to act normal around my wife, help with the kids' bedtime routines, make small talk over dinner, all while knowing what I knew. Every time she said she was taking the kids to her parents' house, I felt sick to my stomach. Ron called me on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks later. "I've got everything you need," he said. "Can you meet me tonight at the same place?" When I sat down across from Ron that evening, he slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "I'm sorry, but it's exactly what you suspected," he said quietly. The report was thorough and devastating. Ron had documented everything with military precision. My wife would drop the kids off at her parents' house around 11 in the morning. Then she'd drive to a small restaurant called Marino's Italian Kitchen, about 20 minutes from her parents' house. There, she'd meet with a man Ron had identified as Robert Bob Thompson, her high school boyfriend. They'd have lunch together, acting like any normal couple, laughing and holding hands across the table. Then, around 1 o'clock, they'd leave in separate cars and drive to the Sunrise Motel, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that charged by the hour. Ron had photos of them going. Separate cars and drive to the Sunrise Motel, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that charged by the hour. Ron had photos of them going into room 12 together, and photos of them leaving separately around 3:30 in the afternoon. After their motel visits, my wife would return to her parents' house, pick up the kids, and drive home. She'd usually arrive around 5:30, just before I got home from work. The routine had been going on for at least 4 months, according to Ron's surveillance. "There's more," Ron said, pulling out another set of documents. "I did some research on this Bob Thompson character, like you asked." Bob was 34 years old, married to a woman named Jennifer, and they had 3 children together, ages 8, 6, and 4. He worked as a vice president of sales for a company called Thompson Building Supply, which was owned by his father-in-law, Jennifer's dad. They lived in a nice house in an upscale neighborhood about 45 minutes from where we lived. "So he's got everything to lose," I said, studying the information. "That's right," Ron nodded. "Good job, wife, kids, house, career. All of it depends on his wife's family." I sat back in my chair, processing everything. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was potentially destroying another family, too. 3 innocent kids who had no idea their dad was a cheating scumbag. "What's your next move?" Ron asked. I'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks. My parents had cheated on each other throughout their marriage, and the fallout absolutely destroyed mine and my siblings' childhood. We'd lived through years of screaming matches, separate bedrooms, and the constant tension of a house where 2 people hated each other but stayed together for the kids. It was something that was totally unacceptable to me. I'd sworn I'd never put my children through that. "I'm filing for divorce," I told Ron. "But first, I want you to do one more thing for me." I asked Ron to make additional copies of his report and all the photos. I had a plan, and it wasn't just about ending my marriage. It was about making sure Bob faced consequences for his actions, too. The next morning, I made an appointment with David Harrison, the best divorce attorney in town. David had handled my friend's divorce a few years earlier and had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive when necessary. David's office was impressive: dark wood paneling, leather chairs, law books lining the walls. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "You've done your homework," he said when I finished. "This level of documentation is going to make things much easier. In this state, adultery doesn't technically affect property division, but it can impact custody arrangements and alimony." We spent 2 hours going over my options and planning the divorce strategy. David explained that I could probably get primary custody of the kids, given the evidence of my wife's behavior and the fact that she'd been lying about her whereabouts while they were in her care. When do you want to serve the papers? David asked. Next Friday, I said. I want her served at work, in front of her colleagues. David raised an eyebrow. That's going to be embarrassing for her. Good, I replied. She should be embarrassed. That same week, I called Ron again. I need you to do one more job for me, I said. I want you to meet with Bob's wife, Jennifer. I want her to know what her husband is doing. Are you sure about this? Ron asked. Once you open this door, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said. She deserves to know the truth, just like I did. Ron agreed to handle it. We coordinated the timing so that Jennifer would learn about her husband's affair on the same day my wife was served with divorce papers. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood. I went to work as usual, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept checking my watch, knowing that at exactly 11 o'clock, a process server would walk into the insurance office where my wife worked and hand her the divorce papers. At 11:15, my phone rang. It was my wife, and she was crying hysterically. How could you do this to me? She sobbed. How could you embarrass me like this at work? The same way you could embarrass me by sleeping with Bob Thompson, I replied calmly. The line went silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, How did you find out? I know everything, I said. The emails, the motel, all of it. I've known for weeks. She started crying harder. We need to talk about this. We can work this out. No, we can't, I told her. I'll be staying at Mike's house for a few days. We can communicate through our lawyers from now on. I hung up and immediately called Ron. It's done on my end. What about Jennifer? I'm meeting with her in an hour, Ron said. I'll call you tonight and let you know how it goes. That evening, Ron called with an update. I met with Jennifer Thompson at her office. She works part-time at an accounting firm. I showed her all the evidence, and she handled it better than I expected. She was shocked, obviously, but she was more angry than upset. She thanked me for telling her and said she needed time to figure out what to do next. How do you think she'll handle it? I asked. Hard to say, but my gut tells me she's not going to take this lying down. She struck me as someone who doesn't get pushed around. Ron's instincts were right. Over the next few weeks, I learned through mutual acquaintances and public records what Jennifer Thompson was doing to her cheating husband, and it was brutal. First, she cleaned out their joint savings account. Apparently there was about $40,000 in there, and she transferred every penny to an account in her name only. Then she took the kids and moved back in with her parents, leaving Bob alone in their house. But the real fireworks started when Jennifer told her father what Bob had been doing. Her dad, who owned Thompson Building Supply, didn't just fire Bob. He had security escort him out of the building and banned him from the property. Since Bob's entire career had been built around working for his father-in-law, he was essentially blacklisted from the industry overnight. Then came the eviction notice. Apparently, Jennifer's parents actually owned the house where Bob and Jennifer had been living. They bought it as a wedding gift, but kept it in their name for tax purposes. Once they learned about Bob's affair, they gave him 30 days to get out. The divorce proceedings were a bloodbath. Jennifer hired the most aggressive attorney in the county, and they went after Bob for everything. Since he no longer had a job or a place to live, he couldn't even afford decent legal representation. But the story gets even better. About 6 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, I heard through the grapevine that Bob had shown up at his old house, the one he'd been evicted from, drunk and angry. He'd apparently been drinking heavily since losing his job, and that night he decided he wanted to talk sense into Jennifer. According to the police report, which became public record, Bob had been banging on the door and shouting for Jennifer to come outside. When she refused, he tried to force his way into the house. That's when Jennifer's brother, who had been staying there to help with the kids, stepped in. The brother was apparently a former Marine, about 6'4" and built like a truck. The confrontation lasted about 30 seconds, ending with Bob on the ground with a broken nose and 2 black eyes. The neighbors called the police, and Bob was arrested for trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. This incident led to a restraining order, which Bob violated twice more over the next month. Each violation meant more jail time and more legal fees he couldn't afford. The man was spiraling completely out of control. Meanwhile, my own divorce was proceeding much more smoothly. My wife had tried to fight for custody initially, but when David presented all the evidence of her affair and the lies she'd been telling about her whereabouts while caring for our children, she backed down quickly. We agreed to joint custody, but I got the kids during the school week, and she got them on weekends. I kept the house, and she moved into a small apartment across town. The whole process took about 4 months, which David said was relatively quick for a divorce with children involved. During this time, Bob's situation continued to deteriorate. His ex-wife Jennifer had taken over his job at her father's company and was apparently doing quite well. She got in the house, the kids, and most of their assets. Bob, on the other hand, had moved into a cheap apartment and was working at a car dealership, making a fraction of what he used to earn. I heard he'd been arrested 2 more times, once for drunk driving and once for getting into a bar fight. Each arrest meant more legal problems and more money he didn't have for attorneys. About 8 months after everything started, I ran into Jennifer Thompson at a grocery store. I wasn't sure if I should approach her, but she recognized me and came over. "You're the one who told me about my husband's affair," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, not sure what to expect. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from anyone involved in this whole mess. "Thank you," she said. "I know it probably wasn't easy to make that decision, but I'm grateful you did. I deserve to know the truth." We talked for a few minutes. She told me she was doing well, that her kids were adjusting to the divorce, and that she was happy working at her father's company. As for Bob, she said he'd left the state about a month earlier. Nobody knew where he'd gone, and frankly, nobody cared. "What about your ex-wife?" Jennifer asked. "We get along well enough for the kids' sake," I told her. "I don't engage with her on anything that isn't related to the children. Now that they're both adults, I don't talk to her at all anymore." And that was the truth. My ex-wife and I maintained a cordial but distant relationship throughout our kids' childhood. We attended school events and sports games without drama. We coordinated schedules efficiently, and we never badmouthed each other in front of the children. I think she learned her lesson about lying and cheating. She never remarried, though she dated a few men over the years. I remarried about 5 years after our divorce to a wonderful woman named Carol, who became a great stepmother to my kids. As for Bob Thompson, I tried to find information about him online years later, just out of curiosity, but there was nothing. No social media profiles, no professional listings, no trace of him anywhere. It was like he'd disappeared completely after leaving our state. The last I heard, through mutual acquaintances, was that he'd moved somewhere out west and was working construction or something similar. His ex-wife Jennifer did great. She took over her father's business when he retired and built it into one of the most successful building supply companies in the region. Looking back on the whole experience, I don't have any regrets about how I handled it. Some people might say I went too far by involving Bob's wife, but I believe she had a right to know what kind of man she was married to. The fact that it destroyed his life was just a consequence of his own choices. My kids, who are now in their 20s, have told me they're grateful that I divorced their mother instead of trying to make a bad marriage work. They saw how miserable some of their friends were whose parents stayed together despite obvious problems, and they appreciated that we put their well-being first. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about exposing the truth and letting the consequences unfold naturally. Bob destroyed his own life through his selfish choices. I just made sure the right people knew what those choices were. Justice, as they say, served itself.